In one of the safest cities in the world, a crime unfolded so calculated, so disturbing, that it forced an entire nation to confront something it believed could never happen here. Hong Kong is a city defined by order. Its streets are dense, disciplined, and relentlessly observed. Violent crime is rare, homicide rarer still. Yet when police entered a quiet village house on the outskirts of the city, nothing in their experience prepared them for what they were about to uncover. This was not a crime of impulse. It was not the result of sudden rage or reckless chaos. It was a crime of planning. And at the center of it was a woman whose life, until that moment, appeared untouchable. Her name was Abby Choi. Welcome to Crimecore Network, where real stories are stripped to their core, and the truth is examined, one detail at a time. Every case has clues, every suspect leaves a trace, and every mystery waits for someone to connect the pieces. In this documentary, we take you inside a case that changed everything. Kindly subscribe for more true crime stories, like share, engage, and comment. This encourages us a lot. Before her name appeared in headlines around the world, Abby Choi was known for something very different. She was a model, a socialite, a fashion influencer. In Hong Kong's elite fashion and lifestyle circles, Abby was a familiar presence, appearing at runway shows, brand launches, and international fashion events. Her image was polished, elegant, and meticulously curated. By early 2023, Abby had built an online following of more than 100,000 people. Her social media feeds reflected a life of luxury, designer gowns, photo shoots for global magazines, carefully staged moments of glamour. But those images told only part of the story. Behind the photographs was a woman navigating responsibilities that rarely make headlines. Public records and reporting indicate that Abby Choi was born in Hong Kong in the mid-1990s. She grew up in the city she would later come to represent on international fashion platforms. Details about her early childhood and education were not widely publicized, a reflection not of secrecy, but of privacy. Unlike many public figures, Abby did not speak often about her schooling or upbringing. There are no verified reports detailing the institution she attended or the academic path she followed. What is known, based on those who knew her personally, is that she entered adulthood early. She became a mother at a young age. And from that point on, much of her life revolved around family. Abby Choi's immediate family remained largely out of the public eye. Her parents were not public figures, and their names and professions were not widely disclosed in media coverage. This absence of detail is not unusual in Hong Kong, where family privacy, particularly among those connected to high-profile cases, is often fiercely protected. There is limited verified information about Abby's siblings. What has been reported consistently is that she maintained close family relationships and relied heavily on a small, trusted inner circle. Friends later described her as someone who valued loyalty and familiarity, someone who preferred private bonds over public attention. Above all else, Abby Choi was a mother. She had 4 children. 2 were from her first marriage. 2 were from her later relationship. Despite the complexity of her family structure, those close to Abby consistently described her as deeply involved in her children's lives. She was present. School schedules were not delegated. Daily routines were closely managed. Pickups and drop-offs were treated as non-negotiable responsibilities. Friends and associates recalled that Abby planned her professional commitments around her children, not the other way around. Fashion events, travel, and shoots were scheduled with precision, ensuring they never interfered with school or family obligations. This detail would later become critical. Because Abby Choi did not miss school pickups, she did not forget her children. She did not disappear without explanation. Abby married Alex Kwong when she was young. The marriage ended years later, but unlike many separations, it did not unfold publicly or explosively. There were no reported custody battles, no visible disputes. The two continued to co-parent their children. They remained in contact. They coordinated schedules. And to those observing from the outside, the relationship appeared civil. This outward calm created an impression of stability, an assumption that conflict, if it existed at all, was manageable. Nothing in their public interactions suggested danger. Later, Abby married Chris Tam, a member of a prominent Hong Kong family known for its presence in the restaurant industry. With Chris, Abby appeared to enter a new phase of life, one marked by financial security, social stability, and visibility. Together, they moved comfortably within elite circles. Their appearances were measured. Their lifestyle appeared settled. To friends and associates, Abby seemed content, not detached from reality, but grounded within it. Those who knew Abby personally described her in terms that rarely align with sensational headlines. They spoke of kindness, of generosity, of someone who avoided confrontation. She was not known to be reckless, not impulsive, not careless with trust. Associates in the fashion world described her as professional and composed, reliable, prepared. Friends spoke of her as gentle, family-oriented, and attentive. No one described her as naive, but many described her as forgiving. From the outside, Abby Choi appeared protected. Protected by wealth, protected by visibility, protected by a city with one of the lowest homicide rates in the world. Hong Kong is not a place where people expect violent crime to reach into family life, let alone erupt from within it. That sense of safety was not unique to Abby. It was shared by millions. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, nothing about Abby Choi's public life suggested danger. On February 19, 2023, she shared what would become her final Instagram post, a professional photo shoot for an international fashion publication. The images were confident, controlled, carefully composed. They reflected continuity, normalcy. But beneath the surface, tensions were quietly forming. At the center of those tensions was money. Abby had purchased a luxury apartment in Kadoorie Hill, one of the most exclusive residential areas in Hong Kong. Instead of registering the property in her own name, she placed it under the name of her former father-in-law. According to investigators, a dispute later emerged over Abby's intention to sell the apartment. The property was reportedly worth tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars. What followed was not a public argument. There were no visible legal proceedings, no recorded confrontations, just quiet disagreement and unresolved resentment. Then came February 21st. That afternoon, Abby failed to do something she never failed to do. She did not arrive to pick up her 8-year-old daughter from school. Hours passed. Calls went unanswered. For those who knew her, this was immediately alarming. Abby Choi was not careless. She was not unreliable. She was not the kind of person who disappeared without explanation. By the end of the day, her family contacted the police. Abby Choi was officially reported missing. What no one yet knew was that, by the time that report was filed, the life so carefully balanced between public image and private responsibility had already been taken. And the city that believed it was safe was about to learn otherwise. By the evening of February 21st, concern had hardened into fear. Abby Choi had still not been located. Her phone remained unreachable. There were no confirmed sightings. For someone so closely tied to her children's daily routines, the absence made no sense. Abby did not miss school pickups. She did not go silent without explanation. When hours passed and nothing changed, the question shifted from, "Where is she?" to, "What could possibly have stopped her?" Family members contacted the police, formally reporting her missing. Officers moved quickly, assembling a timeline that began with ordinary details, appointments, messages, expected stops, then tracing backward from the moment she failed to arrive. Where had she been earlier that day? Who had she spoken to? Where was she supposed to go next? At first, nothing pointed to danger. No reports of an argument, no emergency calls, no alarms raised by the public. What investigators did not yet know was that Abby's disappearance was not recent. It had already been carefully concealed. There were no signs of a struggle in public, no witnesses stepping forward, no disturbance captured by the city's constant surveillance. The absence itself became the clue, an absence so complete it suggested design. And while the search quietly expanded, Hong Kong carried on. Traffic flowed through the evening, schools closed their gates, families returned home. The city's rhythm continued, uninterrupted, unaware that, somewhere beyond the skyline, the truth was being hidden in silence. 3 days passed. On February 24th, the case took a devastating turn. Police traced Abby's last known movements to Tai Po, a quiet, semi-rural district far from the city's financial center. The area was calm, almost anonymous. Narrow roads, modest homes, a place where nothing seemed out of place, until it was. Inside a recently rented village house in Lung Mei Tsuen, officers made a discovery that would shock Hong Kong. Human remains were found inside the property. The house itself was unsettling in its simplicity. It was unfurnished, temporary, devoid of any sign of daily life. Investigators quickly realized this was not a place someone lived in. It was a place someone used. Walls were lined with sale material, an unusual choice that immediately raised questions. The lining appeared intended to prevent stains, a detail that suggested forethought rather than panic. Inside the house, officers found tools that did not belong to any household routine, items associated not with living, but with concealment. What the scene revealed was not disorder, but preparation. Investigators concluded that Abby had been killed inside the house. Forensic analysis later indicated she died from a fatal blow to the head. There was no evidence of a prolonged struggle, no sign of chaos. The absence of disorder was, in itself, a message. What followed was an attempt not just to end a life, but to erase it. The way the scene had been arranged told a story of calculation rather than rage, of intention rather than impulse. Every detail pointed away from spontaneity and toward planning, toward someone who knew what they were doing and why they were doing it. As officers processed the scale of what they were seeing, a realization began to take hold. This was not a random act. It was not the work of an intruder, and it was not the act of a stranger. The location mattered, the preparation mattered, the silence mattered. Whoever was responsible had access. They knew Abby's movements. They understood how to make a disappearance look like nothing at all, at least for a while. By the time the truth surfaced, the gap between what the city believed and what had actually happened was impossible to ignore. The case had moved from a missing person report to one of the most disturbing crime scenes Hong Kong had seen in decades. And the most unsettling question had only just emerged. If this wasn't the work of a stranger, then who had been close enough to make it happen? Once the discovery in Tai Po was confirmed, the investigation shifted into overdrive. This was no longer a case unfolding cautiously over time. It was a race. More than 100 officers were assigned almost immediately, drawn from multiple units across Hong Kong. They did not work sequentially. They worked in parallel. One team secured the village house in Lung Mei Tsuen. Another reviewed surveillance footage from nearby roads and transit points. Others reconstructed Abby Choi's final movements, minute by minute, frame by frame. What police were looking for was not just what happened. They were trying to understand how. And very quickly, something stood out. Access. The village house where Abby's remains were discovered had been rented only weeks earlier. It was unfurnished, temporary. There were no signs of long-term habitation. It was not a place someone lived in. It was a place someone used. Records showed the property was not connected to Abby Choi in any direct way. It was linked instead to people she already knew. That detail changed everything. As detectives traced rental agreements, transport records, and phone activity, the focus narrowed with unsettling speed. The investigation moved away from the streets, away from random suspects, and towards something far closer. Family. This was no longer treated as a missing persons case. It was now a homicide inquiry, and time mattered. On February 25th, just one day after the discovery in Tai Po, police made their first arrests. Abby Choi's former father-in-law was taken into custody. So was her former brother-in-law, and then her former mother-in-law. The speed of the arrests sent shockwaves through Hong Kong. This was not how cases usually unfolded. There had been no public tip-offs, no long press briefings, no gradual build-up. Instead, arrests came quickly, almost abruptly. Investigators alleged that the three were directly connected to the Tai Po house, either through planning, logistics, or attempts to conceal what had taken place. The details were not fully disclosed to the public, but the direction of the case was becoming clear. Yet one name was still missing: Abby Choi's ex-husband, Alex Kwong. As police moved to locate him, they discovered something deeply troubling. Alex was gone. By February 26th, a manhunt was underway. Police issued alerts across border control points, monitored ferry terminals, and tracked recent financial activity. Every hour that passed increased the urgency. Then came a critical lead. Alex Kwong had been spotted near the waterfront. Not sightseeing, not meeting friends. He was attempting to leave Hong Kong by speedboat. The implication was immediate and alarming. When officers intercepted him, they found large sums of cash in his possession, along with luxury watches valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. Items that were portable, easy to carry, easy to convert. The timing was impossible to ignore. This was not coincidence. It was preparation. Alex Kwong was arrested before he could leave the territory. For investigators, the picture sharpened. This was not a spontaneous act driven by panic or emotion. It was organized, coordinated, and planned with escape in mind. But even with arrests made, the investigation was far from complete. Critical evidence was still missing. Large portions of Abby Choi's remains had not been recovered, and in a case defined by concealment, that absence mattered. Police launched extensive search operations across multiple locations. Teams combed through nearby landfill sites, working methodically through layers of waste. Others inspected sewage systems and drainage channels near the village house. The scale of the effort was rare. Officers worked in protective gear, sifting through refuse by hand. The work was slow, exhausting, and uncertain. Days passed. Some remains were recovered, others were not. DNA testing later confirmed that remains found at the scene belonged to Abby Choi. That confirmation brought clarity, but not closure. Questions remained unanswered. Kindly subscribe for more true crime stories if you have not done so. With all principal suspects now in custody, the case entered a new phase. What had begun as a frantic investigation, defined by searches, arrests, and unanswered questions, was now moving into the slow, methodical world of prosecution. And in that shift, everything changed. Because once a case reaches the courtroom, every assumption must give way to evidence. Hong Kong authorities formally charged Abby Choi's former husband, Alex Kwong, his father, Kwong Kao, and his brother, Anthony Kwong, with murder. The charges were severe, among the most serious a person can face under Hong Kong law. But they were not alone. A fourth family member, Alex's mother, Jenny Lee, was charged separately for allegedly obstructing justice, accused of destroying evidence in the aftermath of the killing. It was a moment that stunned the public, not because charges were filed, but because of who they involved. This was no longer a case centered on a single suspect. It was a case that appeared to implicate an entire family. and that raised a disturbing question. How does something like this happen without someone else knowing? Prosecutors did not describe the crime as a spontaneous act. Instead, they presented it as something far more deliberate. According to court filings, the alleged offense involved planning, logistics, and calculated attempts to conceal what had been done. This was not a single decision made in a moment of rage. Authorities alleged it was a sequence of decisions, made over time, with specific roles and specific intentions. But at this stage, the court made one point absolutely clear. These were allegations, not conclusions, not verdicts. And under Hong Kong law, every defendant remained presumed innocent. Still, the gravity of the charges meant the process ahead would be long, careful, and watched closely. Not just by the public, but by legal observers across the region. As proceedings continued, prosecutors began outlining what they believed was the motive. It was not jealousy. It was not revenge. It was money. At the center of the dispute was a luxury apartment in Kadoorie Hill, one of Hong Kong's most exclusive residential neighborhoods. The property was valued at tens of millions of Hong Kong dollars, and its ownership was unusual. Although Abby Choi had purchased the apartment, it had been registered under the name of her former father-in-law. At the time, this arrangement did not appear contentious. But according to prosecutors, that changed when Abby planned to sell the property. That intention, authorities allege, triggered resentment within her former husband's family. What followed, they argue, was not a civil dispute. It was not settled through lawyers or negotiations. Instead, prosecutors allege, it escalated into something far more extreme. And that escalation would ultimately bring the case into a courtroom. Inside the courtroom, the tone was restrained. There were no dramatic speeches, no emotional appeals. The prosecution focused instead on documentation, financial records, property papers, communication logs, timelines. Each piece was presented methodically, not to provoke outrage, but to establish sequence and intent. The court did not speculate beyond what was submitted. There were no assumptions about motive beyond what evidence could support. In a case filled with shocking details, the courtroom remained deliberately quiet, because here, every word mattered. On February 27, 2023, the 4 accused family members appeared in court. It was the first time many in the public saw them formally presented as defendants. The hearing was brief, but decisive. All 4 were denied bail. The judge cited 2 primary concerns: the seriousness of the charges and the risk of interference with evidence. Given what investigators had already uncovered, the court determined that release was not appropriate. The case was adjourned. Prosecutors requested additional time to continue their work, to analyze phone records, forensic findings, and digital communications that could further clarify what had happened. For the defendants, it meant waiting. For the public, it meant uncertainty. Months later, the case expanded again. Additional charges were filed, including preventing the lawful burial of a body. The legal picture grew more complex, and so did the path forward. The case was formally split. Alex Kwong, Kwong Kao, and Anthony Kwong were scheduled to stand trial in the High Court, where Hong Kong's most serious criminal cases are heard. Jenny Lee's case was assigned to the District Court, where lesser charges are adjudicated. The separation reflected differences in alleged involvement, but not the seriousness of the situation. Each court would proceed independently. Each would follow its own timeline. By the end of this phase, one thing was clear. No verdicts had been delivered, no conclusions reached. The courtroom had not yet determined guilt or innocence. Justice, under Hong Kong's legal system, does not move quickly. It moves deliberately, evidence by evidence, argument by argument. And as the case advanced toward trial, the most difficult questions still remained unanswered. What truly happened in the days leading up to Abby Choi's death? How far did the alleged coordination extend? And what would the evidence ultimately prove, or fail to prove, in court? Those answers would not come here. They would come later. When the court hearings ended for the day and the cameras were turned away, what remained was not resolution. It was silence. The kind of silence that settles after something irreversible has occurred. When the public spectacle pauses, but private consequences continue to unfold. For Abby Choi, the story did not end in a courtroom. It ended in absence. She left behind 4 children. Children whose lives were suddenly divided into 2 eras, before and after. There was no gradual transition, no preparation, no explanation that could soften the impact. One day, their mother was part of the rhythm of daily life. School schedules, conversations, plans for the future. The next, she was gone. In the days following the discovery, schools quietly stepped in. Counseling was offered to students affected by the news, not because Abby's children were public figures, but because the shock had rippled outward. It was the kind of case children overheard at home, the kind adults whispered about, the kind that made ordinary routines feel suddenly fragile. And for Abby's family and friends, grief unfolded under a lens they never asked for. There was no private space to process what had happened, no way to retreat from attention. Her social media accounts, once filled with fashion shows, travel, and carefully curated moments, transformed overnight. They became memorials. Comments appeared from around the world, some from strangers who had followed her life online, others from people who had never heard her name before this case. Shock, condolences, disbelief. Many asked the same question, again and again. How could something like this happen here? Hong Kong is a city defined by order. Its homicide rate is among the lowest in the world. Violent crime is rare. Cases involving dismemberment are almost unheard of. That reality is part of the city's identity, a sense of predictability, of structure, of safety. And that is what made the Abby Choi case so unsettling. It did not fit the narrative people believed about where they lived. This was not a crime that emerged from chaos on the streets. It was not random. It was not the result of an unexpected encounter with a stranger. It unfolded quietly, behind closed doors, within relationships that appeared familiar, within a world that looked, from the outside, stable, and that forced difficult questions. Not about dark alleys or unseen threats, but about trust, proximity, and the assumptions people make about those closest to them. Commentators began drawing comparisons to other crimes that had once shaken Hong Kong's sense of certainty, murders that became cultural reference points decades earlier. Cases remembered not only for their brutality, but for the way they disrupted the belief that this does not happen here. Yet many observers noted something different about this case. Those earlier crimes felt external. This one felt intimate. It did not expose danger from outside the system. It exposed danger from within it. As this documentary is produced, the legal process remains unfinished. There have been no final verdicts, no definitive conclusions. The court will decide guilt or innocence, based on evidence, testimony, and law. That process takes time, and it is deliberately slow. But the passage of time does not answer everything. Some questions linger beyond the reach of any verdict. Why did a financial dispute escalate to this extent? Why were such extreme measures taken rather than legal ones? And what happened to the parts of Abby Choi's remains that were never recovered? These are questions the justice system may never fully resolve. They exist in the gaps between evidence and understanding. They remain part of the silence left behind. And it is here, in that silence, that the weight of the case truly settles. Because it is easy, over time, for stories like this to become defined only by their brutality, by headlines, by shock, by the most disturbing details. But Abby Choi was more than the crime that ended her life. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend. She was someone who existed beyond a single moment of violence, someone whose life included laughter, responsibility, ambition, and connection. Those who knew her did not lose a headline. They lost a person. Her story now exists as a reminder, not only of what was taken, but of what assumptions can obscure. That safety is never absolute. That wealth does not equal protection. That familiarity does not guarantee security. And that violence does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind routine, behind trust, behind relationships that appear ordinary. For Hong Kong, this case will be remembered as a moment when certainty cracked, when a city known for order was forced to confront the limits of its own expectations. And for those who loved Abby Choi, the search for closure continues. Not in press conferences, not in headlines, but quietly, away from the cameras, away from public judgment. In a space where answers are fewer and memory carries the weight that justice cannot yet provide. What happened next is not about motive, but about how silence protected the crime. This final section does not speculate, it does not diagnose, and it does not attempt to explain violence through labels. It looks only at what the case itself reveals, through evidence, through sequence, and through absence. What matters here is not who the offenders were or how they have been described elsewhere. What matters is how a crime of this scale remained hidden for as long as it did, in a city that prides itself on safety, structure, and order. Because this case did not disappear by accident. It disappeared through silence. Crimes that vanish quickly often share one defining feature. They do not announce themselves. There was no public confrontation that drew witnesses. No emergency call that triggered immediate response. No visible disturbance that forced intervention. What occurred did not spill outward. It folded inward. The crime ended quietly, and then silence followed. That silence mattered. In many investigations, attention is the turning point. Noise creates records. Chaos creates witnesses. Disruption creates timelines. Here, there was none. The absence of noise did not signal safety. It signaled containment. Silence is not passive. Silence is active. It delays recognition. It reshapes urgency. It allows time to pass without challenge. In this case, silence bought distance. Between the crime and its discovery, between the act and the response, between responsibility and consequence. By the time questions were asked, the moment for interruption had already passed. As investigators reconstructed events, a pattern began to emerge, not of emotion, but of function. The violence in this case was not expressive. It did not seek recognition. It did not communicate meaning. It did not attempt to shock or provoke. It was instrumental. Instrumental violence is defined not by feeling, but by outcome. The goal is not to be seen. The goal is to complete an action, and then remove its trace. Here, there were no symbolic gestures, no messages left behind, no attempt to frame a narrative. Nothing about the crime invited interpretation. That absence was deliberate. Crimes like this evade detection not because they are complex, but because they are contained. They happen within boundaries of place, of relationship, of expectation. And containment is one of the most effective forms of concealment. Another factor that shaped the invisibility of this crime was proximity. This was not a crime committed by a stranger. It did not require forced entry. It did not rely on random opportunity. It did not draw attention through unfamiliarity. Familiarity lowers defenses. When access is expected, movement goes unchallenged. Presence is not questioned. Trust alters perception. What might seem suspicious in another context appears normal when filtered through relationship. This is one of the most difficult realities for investigators. Crimes committed within trusted circles often move slower, not because evidence is absent, but because suspicion arrives late. In this case, proximity reduced scrutiny, and scrutiny delayed is opportunity extended. Trust does not fail loudly. It fails quietly. It creates assumptions. It fills gaps with reassurance. It postpones doubt. By the time doubt becomes unavoidable, the damage is already embedded. Here, familiarity did not just grant access. It shaped the timeline of response. The crime was not hidden behind locks. It was hidden behind expectation. Technology also played a role, not as a limitation, but as a boundary. Modern investigative systems allowed police to act quickly once the crime was uncovered, but concealment did not rely on advanced methods. It relied on principles older than technology: delay, fragmentation, and disposal. Delay stretches time until urgency fades. Fragmentation breaks continuity. Disposal removes context. None of these require sophistication. They require patience. The crime was not hidden by intelligence. It was hidden by time. Time creates distance. Distance dulls clarity. And clarity delayed is clarity weakened. What ultimately ended the silence was not insight or theory. It was exposure. Evidence surfaced, patterns aligned, and concealment failed. Not because it was flawed, but because no concealment is permanent. Silence works until it doesn't. The psychological weight of this case does not rest with those accused. It rests with what followed. Children left without answers. A family structure fractured beyond repair. And a city forced to confront a truth it rarely faces. Safety does not eliminate risk. It reshapes it. In environments defined by order, violence does not disappear. It adapts. It moves inward. It becomes quieter. And it relies on trust to remain unseen. This case challenged assumptions, not about crime rates, but about certainty. It revealed that the most disturbing crimes are not always those that erupt suddenly, but those that unfold unnoticed. Not because no one cares, but because no one is alerted in time. For those closest to the victim, the aftermath extended far beyond the investigation. Grief did not arrive with closure. It arrived with questions. Questions without timelines, without clear endpoints, without answers that restore balance. Cold silence does not end when a case is exposed. It lingers. This is the lasting psychological consequence of crimes like this. They fracture not only families, but assumptions. They force communities to reconsider where danger originates and how it hides. Not in chaos, but in familiarity. Not in darkness, but in plain sight. This case was not solved through psychological profiling. It was not resolved by understanding motive. It was resolved when evidence surfaced and silence lost its hold. That distinction matters because it reminds us that explanation is not prevention, and understanding does not equal protection. Awareness begins with attention, and attention begins when silence ends. Abby Choi's story does not end with a verdict. It continues in memory, in absence, and in the questions that remain. Do subscribe, hit the notification button. See you again in our next documentary. Love from Crimecore Network, signing off.